Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the museum. I'm John Holler, the president and CEO, and on behalf of the trustees and the members and the staff and everyone involved with the museum, it's a pleasure to welcome you here tonight. It's especially a happy occasion for us because we are kicking off the public program part of what is a celebration that began last October of 40 years of the networked world that we all take for granted today. I want to thank our generous sponsors, first of all, this evening. Intel Corporation, which is a very good friend of the museum, is the lead sponsor for the Net at 40 program this year. And tonight, we also have generous funding for this kickoff from Symantec Corporation. And as always, we enjoy the support of our donors and our members. And I hope you'll become one tonight if you aren't already there. How many of you are here for the first time, by the way? A few. Welcome. Good to have you here. How many of you are hackers? We have a prosecutor here tonight. Just remember that. Next, I want to acknowledge and thank a very special partner, National Public Radio. NPR and the museum have been jointly pursuing the anniversary Net at 40 since last May when I met with Ellen Weiss, the Vice President of News in Washington. We jointly kicked off our collaboration last October 29th, which is 40 years to the day, when Bill Duvall and Charlie Klein made their historic computer-to-computer transmission. We have a fabulous lineup of programming in this series, and I'm going to take just a moment to tell you about it. On Thursday evening, May 13th, Guy Raz of NPR, you probably hear him on the weekends, Weekend All Things Considered, will be in conversation with network visionary Bob Taylor, whom many of you know, a lot of you personally. Bob, of course, headed ARPA's Information Processing Techniques Office from 1965 to 1969. He later founded the Computer Systems Lab at Xerox PARC. Bob's name is associated with the beginning of networking as much as anyone's, and we'll be delighted to have him here talking to Guy. On June 2nd and 3rd, we'll celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Plato system, which was developed at the University of Illinois and later at CDC. Plato is probably one of the great untold stories in American computing, and it was a forerunner of many of the networked applications we take for granted today. It will be a two-day conference, June 2nd and 3rd. We'll have 7 panels in 2 days, and the list of guests is just incredible. Don Bitzer, the founder of Plato, Ray Ozzie, chief software architect at Microsoft, John Markoff, Phil McKinney of HP. A number of people will be here. It's going to be a great couple of days. On June 21st, maybe one of the greatest, if not the greatest whiz kid of the internet, Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, will be here in conversation again with Guy Raz of NPR and writer David Kirkpatrick, who has just written a new book called The Facebook Effect. And then finally, on August 19th, NPR's Laura Seidel is going to moderate an evening featuring Dr. Genevieve Bell, who is an Intel fellow and an anthropologist, a social engineer, if you will, who leads an R&D team looking at human factors in the design of new technology, looking for the next big idea in human-computer interaction, and I think you'll enjoy that as well. So we are covering a lot of ground in this 40-year celebration. We'll capture all this on YouTube, and it will be on our channel in case you can't be here personally, or if you don't hear the stories on NPR. So it's going to be a big several months here at the museum. And now let me turn to the introduction of tonight's program. One fascinating thing about being a student of history is you constantly are reminded that most things are older than you think. Hackers and phishers and opportunists have been around as long as networks have been around. There were rogue telegraph operators during the 19th century. And they broke the law often by just doing benign things like transmitting gossip and wedding announcements to each other over the wires. In the 20th century, ham radio operators and amateur radio operators in the days before regulation loved to listen to actual emergencies being broadcast, and they liked it so much they occasionally signed on and made up their own emergencies and broadcast them to each other just to give each other a little thrill before regulation. But what we're examining tonight, of course, is a lot more dangerous. It's the story of cybercrime and cybersecurity, and no one could be better to help introduce the topic and our distinguished panel than someone who is himself a former hacker. Kevin Poulsen now has a legitimate job as the senior editor of Wired magazine, writing about cybercrime and piracy and defense. He's been interviewed by the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN. He has a long list of credits. But before his days as a journalist began, Kevin had a notorious career in the 1980s as a hacker with the handle Dark Dante. He worked for SRI International by day, and he hacked by night. He occupied the world of cybercrime fully. He eventually got caught, and that's why, since he's caught and the statute of limitations has run, he's agreed to moderate a panel with a prosecutor on it. So we're delighted to have him. I just want to say that Rashna Damija, who was also a panelist, is not here tonight, but everyone else is. And we'll start. Please join me by welcoming Wired Magazine's Kevin Poulsen.
I guess the first time I've heard journalism described as a legitimate job. I want to thank John and the museum for putting this event together. We have a great panel tonight. I think before I start, since this is a museum, I'm going to do a moment of show and tell. This green piece of paper, something I got in the mail not too long ago, this is notifying me that my credit card number was stolen by a hacker. Since we have a good audience here tonight, I'd like to see a show of hands of everybody who's gotten a notice like this in the past few years. That's about what I expected. Now keep your hand up if you've gotten more than one. Wow. Yeah, this particular notice, I might donate it to the museum. Tells me that I was a victim of the hacker that broke into TJX's network. There were 40 million of these notices that went out. At the time, the breach was discovered in 2007. It began in 2005. At the time, it was the largest breach of credit card data. Since there have been larger ones. The culprit was Albert Gonzalez, a Miami man. So what this tells me is that Albert Gonzalez stole my credit card number, that he, we now know, in all likelihood, provided it to a man in the Ukraine named Maxik, who then sold it on the international black market for $20 to $30, depending on how much my credit card was worth. Probably 20. And that's, Gonzalez was eventually caught, and he was sentenced just recently to 20 years in prison for that and for other breaches. 20 years is a very long time. It was a record-breaking sentence. 20 years ago, I was a hacker, and I can tell you, unlike Gonzalez, I did not have $1 million buried in my backyard. So that's the big change that we've seen, is that hacking has gone from something recreational to something that's enormously profitable, and it's global, and it's extremely well organized. So that's one of the things that I'm going to be asking our panelists about, how much we should be worried about this, and what the future of this globalized cybercrime market is. I'm going to ask them to come up now. Sit down anywhere. Plenty of seats. Not that one. Nope. I'm just kidding. Okay, starting nearest me, we have Dave Cole. He's a senior director of consumer products at Symantec, a company that does not yet recognize Windows XP as a virus. Audrey Plonk, next to him, she's the Global Security and Internet Policy Specialist at Intel Corporation. And at the far end, somebody who I think may have been one of the guys that caught me, Matt Parrella. He's an assistant U.S. attorney and the chief of the Computer Hacking and Intellectual Property Squad at the Department of Justice in Silicon Valley. Thank you all. Matt, 20 years for hacking my credit card number. Is that a fair sentence?
Well, in this particular case, which was not, we cooperated on the investigation excuse me, but ultimately the plea was, and the conviction was taken back east. As you know, federal crimes are indexed towards the loss that is, or the gain by the criminal or the loss to the victim. And in this particular case, the loss was titanic. I mean, the amount of credit cards, the amount of value that the individual got was commensurate with the amount of the sentence. I mean, very often we see, we hear complaints about white-collar criminals stealing $10 million and getting, you know, a year or two in jail, and then somebody robs a 7-Eleven and gets 10 years in jail. Well, I think that's unfair, and this maybe redresses the balance.
Okay. You could argue that murderers sometimes don't get 20 years in prison.
It's true. That happens. Unfortunately, not unfortunately actually, but sentencing is a very fact-driven decision made by a court. And because every case is different, every sentence is going to be different, even within the same types of crimes. I mean, there are many, many hackers who hacked credit card companies who did not get 20 years. Why? Because the aggravating factors were not there. And maybe they had some mitigating factors.
Okay. I think I'd like to kick things off by asking each of the panelists to tell us what we should be most afraid of these days. Is it cybercrime, people like Gonzalez? Is it cyber espionage, like these massive attacks that were recently reported against Google and other companies? Cyber warfare, which is in the news a lot lately. Richard Clark, a former cybersecurity czar, has a book out that says that hackers could make our copy machines explode. Yeah, it actually says that. Or cyber-terrorism, which has been talked about. And let's start with you, Dave.
Sure. So I have a tendency to focus on the things I can do something about. So unless any of you are planning on mounting an attack on, you know, cyber-terrorism or, you know, defending the nation's infrastructure, I think the thing that people should focus on and the thing that they can impact is how basically cybercrime would affect themselves or their family. So, you know, the thing that, when it comes to me as an individual, thing that I'm always most concerned about is my identity. I've had my identity stolen before through a very offline, mundane way. But having said that, it's such a pain to repair your identity. It takes so much time. It's so expensive. Identity theft is a thing that's the most troublesome for any individual. But the thing that concerns me the most is, you know, primarily the family issues that we're seeing today, and the amount of cyberbullying and the amount of things that are happening in social networks, people inadvertently giving out information that's being used against them, not only to infect them, but also, you know, to stalk kids, grooming, that sort of thing. So that's the thing that personally I think is the most troublesome, worrisome.
So the scariest thing isn't even cybercrime, then it's more like social interactions gone bad?
Well, I think that's how a lot of the hacking is happening today. If you go back to kind of early 2000, even late 90s, even, you know, just a few years ago, a lot of the way that people were getting infected was primarily through exploitation of vulnerabilities, right? I mean, there was a heyday with ActiveX and Internet Explorer. It moved on to Mozilla. It moved on to, you know, Adobe, and it just keeps cycling through all these things associated with the browser. But the reality is that a lot of it today is by convincing someone to click either on a bogus alert for something or tricking someone into clicking on a video link inside, you know, Facebook or any social networking. So a lot of it today really is about hacking the person rather than hacking the box.
Okay. Audrey, crime, terrorism, war, or espionage?
All and none of the above. No, I think I would say maybe what we need to be most worried about is that government and industry don't get it right, whatever that may mean. And I think from a government perspective, it's we should be worried that government isn't going to get the policy right and the law right and the regulation right that's going to enable the environment, and that industry is not going to continue to be able to drive the right kind of technologies to solve the problem. So I think it's not right today, or it's not a full solution today. And so I think what maybe the biggest fear isn't necessarily all of those things you just said, because they will probably continue to be the case, just like we'll continue to have crime and war and terrorism in the kinetic world, but we So we, on some level, will probably continue to have it in the cyber world, but how we deal with it and whether we get the right mechanisms to deal with it is, I think, the most important thing.
And it's possible that we won't.
It's absolutely possible we won't.
Matt?
Well, I agree with Audrey that all of the above, but if I had to pick one, I would say that the threat to the intellectual property rights and intellectual property, especially in Silicon Valley, is the primary threat that we're faced with in law enforcement. Maybe in other parts of the United States and in other parts of the world, the social networking threat might, or the threats that arise through that might be greater. But here, what we see, what I'm seeing from the FBI, from the Secret Service, and from ICE and the other investigating agencies, is that we here in Silicon Valley are under attack. And it's an attack on the intellectual property rights of the industry here. That's a direct threat to the economic security of the region, which, if you look at the economic engine that Silicon Valley as a whole is, it's a threat to the national security of the United States. So that, I would have to say, is the greatest problem. The attack is not just inside, it's not just from outside in, it's from inside out too. It doesn't really fall within the hacking umbrella that maybe we're focused on here, but it's a tremendous amount of insiders utilizing or stealing their own companies' intellectual property, and then either moving on or shipping it on and selling it. And just to follow the thought to the end, the threat to the IP sometimes is organized crime sponsored, state sponsored, and sometimes industry sponsored. And so that's what I would say is the major threat.
Now, we're kind of in the middle of a lot of news about exactly that threat. It was just reported that the hackers that broke into Google, very sophisticated hackers, it was traced to China, and they stole the proprietary source code for Google's central password system, which turned something that before looked like it might be politically motivated espionage into something that was at least also IP-oriented espionage. How much of that, and don't worry, we're not taking notes or anything, how much of that do you see in the CHIPS unit? Like foreign hackers coming in and stealing our economic secrets or our trade secrets.
Let me just disconnect my answer from your question. So I have a job tomorrow. That is a major component of what I was just talking about. Now, to be able to follow the thread through into whether it's actually coming from a foreign government or it's just a business entity or it's a citizen or it's an organized crime element in a foreign country, that's a different story. Many times we don't have the ability to do that, and that's one of the great challenges for law enforcement now. When Audrey was talking about government and industry getting it right, that's one of the critical things, is the ability for American law enforcement, which really, especially in an area like this, leads the way, and that other countries, Western Europe and Asia, look to as models for their law enforcement. We need to be able to access evidence that is housed in servers in Pakistan, in China, in other areas, because so often we'll have an exploit be reported to us by a company in Silicon Valley, and we'll run it through, and it'll come to a server in a place that will not respond in terms of requests for evidence. And that's very frustrating, and it's more than frustrating. It's, in some ways, providing a safe haven for criminals.
So are you saying that you need a clear legal authority to go in and hack those computers to retrieve evidence?
No.
That's happened.
We would do it legally, Kevin. I know your mind goes the other way, but we would actually ask for it.
But you mentioned safe havens. There are countries where you're not going to get cooperation.
That's correct.
And there was a case in Seattle around 2000 where the FBI hacked into a hacker's computer in Russia to seize evidence because they weren't getting cooperation from the Russian police.
Well, I think in that particular case, they didn't actually hack into it. They had some consent from the individual involved. But
if by consent you mean they had a keylogger installed on the computer he used and grabbed his password, I'll give you that.
The point is they did go to another country and obtain evidence, and that's a real problem. That's.
But you don't see that as a model for countries that don't.
No, we're not permitted to run investigations in other countries without their consent. So.
Okay. Because I thought that was awesome. Right. Audrey, you're kind of an expert on international law. I shouldn't have said kind of. You are an expert. What's the situation now with safe havens? There was just an announcement of some carders, a credit card or banking-related organized criminals in Belarus who were arrested as part of an FBI investigation. They were arrested in Belarus by local authorities. There was a report that a Russian hacker who participated in a massive ATM cash-out operation was actually arrested by the Russian police. It seems like these are good signs from countries that haven't always cooperated, but then there are still some safe havens out there, aren't there?
Yeah, of course. I think it's, and just to be clear, I'm actually not a lawyer, so maybe not an expert in international law, but I've certainly looked at this for some years now. And yeah, it seems like the situation is slowly improving incrementally, and I think on some level that is in direct proportion to how much we, as our government is doing and other governments are doing to really try to build up capacity in other countries and really make this a platform for government policy. 10, 15 years ago, I don't think there was a single person in the diplomatic corps that probably paid much attention to trying to get random countries to help with law enforcement assistance on cybercrime issues, and that's getting better. I don't think we're doing enough, and I think until we get to the point where it's core to our foreign policy and our diplomatic policy to try to get countries to do things like accede to the Convention on Cybercrime that the Council of Europe has put out, or continue with training programs and enabling countries to build capacity in this way, and then really holding them to the assistance that law enforcement needs in a global way, we're not really going to succeed. And there's been a lot of efforts in the Congress over the past few months and several years to try to, influence other countries to adopt principles that the United States holds near and dear. That's been of limited success, I think, because Congress is Congress. It's intended to write domestic legislation, not conduct foreign policy operations. So I really think that as a comprehensive government strategist, what I mean when I say get it right, if it's not really part of our core foreign policy of getting countries to provide this kind of assistance, then we're probably not going to succeed in a comprehensive way.
If you're a hacker today, what's the best country to be in?
I don't know. It's
Come
debatable.
On, it's Ukraine, right?
It's the Ukraine, Russia, maybe. Yeah.
There's a lot of them.
There's quite a few.
What's your number one? Huh? What's your number one? What country would you most like to be able to go into to call people out of?
As I said, there's quite a few of them. I don't want to name a particular suspect here.
But I mean, I think we have a real challenge. I think today, I checked the stats, and we have 29 countries who've acceded to the Convention on Cybercrime, is that right? It's 29 out of 191 UN member states, so we have a long ways to go before we actually can claim we have harmonized legal mechanisms globally that can enable this kind of cooperation.
Yeah. So we have Eastern European hackers stealing money from our bank accounts and stealing our credit card numbers. And we have Asian hackers stealing our secrets and hacking Google. How did we get to this point, David? It seems like it was just yesterday that the hacker was Matthew Broderick hacking from his bedroom.
Well, we saw this from the virus side pretty clearly. I mean, you saw viruses that were really pranks, digital graffiti, all the way through up into probably, they got more destructive, they got a little stealthier, up until like the late 90s. And then you started seeing things like NetSki, you started seeing adware really came on the scene around 2000. So you had stuff that was sort of paving the way for more overt kind of key logging and Trojan horses. And you also saw the volume of malware kind of creeping up, and things got less imaginative, to the point now to where, you can pretty much predict kind of where the threats are going to go based upon where the money's at. And you see a lot less imaginative, kind of creative style prank hacking. So we really, as we looked at it, you started to see, threats get more destructive. You saw the distributed denial of service attacks of like late 98, 99, and then you went into full-on threats today that are primarily focused on either identity theft. You had, the marketing gone wild days of 2000 to like 2005, 2006 with adware and the spyware bonanza, phishing, which hit around 2005 and started up to where today, you don't see that many pranks. You see some pranks and, people like breaking your Sony PSP because it's fun to hack a new platform and that sort of thing. But today, predominantly what you see are threats that are trying to get onto the machine, get into it quickly, steal the information and send it off to, to another machine. So it's gotten to the point to where, we're seeing this year we predict we'll add anywhere from 3.3 to 3.5 million detections to the product, which is unbelievable when you consider a few years ago it was a big year if you added in, 100 to 200,000.
So is it getting harder to keep up?
Oh, absolutely.
Are the hackers winning in this malware detection war?
Yeah, I'd be lying if I said that was the first time that someone had asked me that. And it's sort of the same answer to where, are we winning in offline crime, right? It's the same sort of thing. We've got a really motivated enemy. I know Matt has opinions about this, but we've got a really motivated enemy, and it goes back and forth. It's a big chess match. But in terms of keeping up, it's harder than it ever was, and we're in a mature space. So, the challenge we have is that the market is very competitive in security. But having said that, the amount of investment that we have to put into the products is actually, as higher than it's ever needed to be before. For example, it wasn't so long ago when you did a virus update, once a day we'd put out content, or 3 to 4 times a day. That was a big shift. And now, if you don't have your security updates online and you're not checking them immediately to see if that new file is a threat, or putting down updates every couple minutes, you're out of date. So the model has shifted dramatically in the past 3 to 4 years.
So my AV has to get new definitions every couple of minutes, or I'm at risk?
Well, with some products, yes. The way that our product works is that so much of it is shifted to where it's not definition based at all, to where it's detecting based upon the behavior of the application. Heuristics. But the heuristics have to be backed by a lot of whitelisting, and we use reputation technology, meaning if it's signed, if it came from a reliable place, it's probably not bad. So a lot of that kind of quality assurance has to go in it, otherwise the heuristics can be almost as bad as the threat.
While we're on the subject, there's something I have to ask. I'm writing a book about a professional hacker named Max Vision. The book is Kingpin. It's out from Crown February of next year. Buy it. He was talking about how whenever he deployed malware for his own purposes, he would take off-the-shelf stuff that's circulated in the underground, but then he would modify it. And then before he deployed it, he had a little laboratory of about 20, he claimed, virtual machines, all running different Windows configurations and different AV software. And he would run the malware through all of them at the same time. And it was only when he'd gotten the code to the point where it would clear all of this would he send it out. So he knows 100% that that's not going to be detected, at least at the moment that he ships it. How do you defend against something like that?
Well, a lot of these guys, so that's typical today. And matter of fact, most of the way that the malware is produced today, and the reason why there's so many unique detections out there now, is because there's a technique that's being used where it's actually modified on the server. So literally every executable that's served up, you don't have a chance of having a virus definition for it. It's literally not going to exist at that time. You have to catch it with heuristics or some kind of broader technique, and then make sure that you're not detecting something that isn't a threat, that's actually a core Windows system file. So they don't damage the machine. That's all right. Yeah. but you have to have those measures in place. So yeah, I mean, today it's even worse than, the situation is even worse than what Max Vision was cranking out. So the way that we deal with it is, basically the product has to access the cloud. And I know it's the buzzword of the minute, but you have to access real-time intelligence to make a decision about something based on what it's doing on the machine. And a lot of times the guys who are releasing the threats are pretty lazy, meaning what they do is they check the signature-based technology. So they just kind of run a scan and see if they detect it rather than executing it in the environment, which is where the heuristics and the rest of the online information kick in and all of that. So it's harder for them to test the right way.
Okay. Audrey, you mentioned that the big challenge now is going to be how we craft policies to deal with these various threats. Is there a role for Congress here? I know there's cybercrime legislation that's progressing. Are they actually going to do something useful?
I'm sure they will do something useful. I have the utmost confidence in our Congress to act swiftly and intelligently on the issue. I think there's a lot of really smart people who are thinking about it. I think a few of the challenges that are there, which I will just highlight, and not at all profess to have the solutions to, is that from a jurisdictional perspective in government, this is really just, it's spread across a whole bunch of different committees in Congress and departments and agencies in the federal government. So it makes it really difficult to find, who's the right touch point, who's going to own this, who's going to drive this. And so, we have legislation out of the Senate Commerce Committee, out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, out of science and technology committees in both the House. And so there's a lot of people who think that they own cybersecurity. And so the question is, who owns it and do they own it? But I certainly think there's a role for Congress and frankly for the administration to fill in the legislative gaps with reasonable policy solutions that don't necessarily need laws. I think Matt could talk better about cybercrime reform, legal reform for cybercrime laws that might be needed better than I can. But I think right now what the Congress is really struggling with is how do we define critical infrastructure and how do we protect it from online attack? And that's a real tough one, and they've been struggling with it for some time. So I think, hopefully they will come to a reasonable solution. Like I said, there's a lot of very, very smart, good people trying their best.
What do you think of Rockefeller Snow? Is that right?
Rockefeller Snow. I think the Rockefeller Snow bill does a lot of, or at least tries to do a lot of good. There's a lot of good things in the bill. It talks a lot about investing in research and development, in education, and training a workforce to manage federal systems and networks, which is clearly a space where we've been underinvesting as a country for some time. I think there are more problematic provisions in Rockefeller Snow, things about specifically how the infrastructure gets defined. I think in the United States we've sort of come to decide that everything's critical, and you run up against some issues. If everything is critical, then nothing is critical. So what's critical, and how do you protect those critical assets? And so it's not an easy thing to do, but Rockefeller Snow proposes that the president make a rule about it, so it's basically a new regulation, which is a little different than how it's handled today. There's also some problematic language around the role of standards, I think, and this challenge of how to develop new security standards and how to hold people accountable to those standards and whether that needs to be regulated or not. And I certainly think standards are a useful thing, but I think mandating and regulating standards definitely runs up against some problems just in terms of how quickly the industry changes and how quickly the standards need to adapt to that. And regulation is often a little bit too in the here and now rather than in the future.
The issue with standards, whenever I hear like standards being applied or discussion of standards for cybersecurity, I think of PCI, which is this Visa-created standard to protect financial systems or anything that handles credit card data. And some of the, speaking of Albert Gonzalez, who I was talking about before, some of the systems that he or his conspirators breached had passed PCI certification. And it turns out that the PCI certification for cybersecurity involves things like you must have a firewall. They're kind of like vague, you have to keep things secure. And so not surprisingly, you can pass an audit and still be vulnerable. One of these guys was audited while the hackers were in the system and the auditors didn't notice. So standards work great, I think, when it comes to like something you can define rigidly, like encryption. Like the PCI standard for encrypting pins is solid. But when it comes to something like how to protect the system, is it possible to define like a broad standard that can apply to all sorts of different situations and network infrastructures?
Maybe it's possible, but I think it's not the role of Congress to legislate the standard, and I think that's where the Rockefeller-Snow bill, specifically to your question, runs up. I think you have a challenge writing that kind of standard, and I think you'd certainly have a challenge enforcing it through regulation, just because it will inevitably need to change. I think that the challenge with security is that you know, we don't really have a standard that's like, oh, here's what a secure platform looks like. So if you just, you know, certify to this standard, you'll know your platform is secure, because security means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And the other, I think, problem with standards is that government has decided, well, that's, or at least is thinking about, well, this is the way to go. If we can standardize and we can tell you to adhere to the standard, then we'll have increased confidence in the products or the systems and networks that we're using. And then every government thinks that, and then they're like, oh, well, we'll have our own standard, and it will look different than your standard. And then, you know, you've got interoperability that's gone out the window, and then you've got proprietary crypto all over the place, and, or, you know, you end up with this really lack of harmonization across the world, which actually puts potentially everyone at a disadvantage, because you're not if you're a technology company, for example, you can't build to a global market, and if you're a user, you can't necessarily trust what you're getting, because you don't know what it's standardized to and who's behind it. So I think that's a real challenge we're going to have going forward.
Matt, I don't know if you're allowed to comment on something like this, but is there any law that you think is missing? Is there something Congress could do to help you as a cybercrime fighter?
Well, yeah, there are a lot of things they could do. But just to follow up with the last thought, the other part of the equation, of the security equation, is industry. The people on the victim end have to be prepared, have to prepare themselves to be, as we call them, good victims, so that when an event happens, an exploit happens, and they come in, we have the capability of investigating it and maybe actually doing something about it. It's unfortunately rather common to go into a corporation, even some rather large ones, after an exploit, and ask them, okay, can we see your log files? And they say, we didn't have our logging function turned on. That's literally true. So it makes for a pretty quick investigation, but and we get to clear the case pretty quickly. But that's not great. But to answer your question directly, what I think where Congress needs to take a role is in, and it's unusual, because typically we look to Congress to make things illegal, make this illegal, make that illegal, put it. You know, increase sentencing or whatever. But in this particular case, I think what the country needs is some unification and guidance on the ability to investigate and methods of investigation. And by that I mean search warrants, wiretaps, things like that. We're very fractionized, if that's a word, in the United States. The law is very different in different federal circuits, and it is an incredible hindrance to law enforcement right now. That's where Congress needs to show some leadership and get involved with that. That would help tremendously. Basically, the crimes, the federal criminal framework that they have in place now, it will cover virtually, you know, what we need to do.
It's interesting you should bring that up. There's a coalition, I'm sure you know this, that was recently formed by a lot of electronic civil rights groups and technology companies, Google and a ton of others, to basically rework the laws that govern law enforcement access to things like email and data stored in the cloud. Right now, it's like this patchwork of laws where there's a suspect's email, for example, is protected differently depending on whether it's 180 days old or newer than 180 days old.
And depending on what federal circuit you're in.
Right, because of differences in how these outdated laws are being interpreted. So this coalition basically wants to say, wants to raise everything to the level where you need probable cause that a crime has been committed and that the person, correct me if I'm wrong, person that you're going after, or the person whose information you're after had a role in committing the crime. Whereas now you can get old email on a reasonable suspicion standard, a reasonable suspicion that the information will be useful in an investigation.
It's actually, in some cases, in some circuits, more generous than that. And it has to do with how Congress defined an electronic communication service and a remote computing service,
right, and
how emails are held, and if they're held for over 180 days, they're considered to be in storage, and whether they're read or not. And it's a very complex thing. However, it was not thoughtless. It was not done thoughtlessly.
I didn't say
it's not a complete patchwork. In 18 U.S.C. 2703, there's an attempt to unify it, but I just think that the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, I just think that needs to be updated, streamlined, and made available. The example that you gave, where if it's over 180 days old, 181 days, and it's an electronic, and it's on a electronic communication service and it's unopened, that can be accessed with a subpoena under ECPA, Electronic Communications Privacy Act. However, notice has to be given to the individual who holds that account, and they have the opportunity to contest that unless we apply to the court and get delayed notice, or we certify that we get some delayed notice, and that puts off the ability to contest the subpoena until later. So there are a number of checks and balances built right within it. It's not as if we can waltz in and to electronic communication service anyway and take anything. But the probable cause standard is still in place for search warrants. So if we're doing a search warrant of an email account, we're going to Yahoo and we want a search warrant of an email account, we have to show probable cause that it's either evidence, fruits of a crime, or instrumentality of a crime.
Right. I mean, the issue is sometimes you don't need a search warrant. Sometimes a subpoena or a 2703 order is
2703D order, yes. In certain cases, that's
so. It sounds like everybody agrees that there needs to be some streamlining here. And that these laws were written in 1986 based on Congress's understanding of the internet at that time. Yeah. Should the streamlining lower everything to the subpoena standard, or as these groups are saying, should it raise everything to a probable cause standard so you always need a search warrant to get somebody's email?
Well, that's a good question. It would certainly I don't think it would be in accord with how we obtain evidence in other arenas to have it be available by a subpoena. So I don't think it would be consistent. In other words, a brand new email that we would want to do a search warrant to capture the email account. That would not be in accord with, let's say, if we were, we can subpoena records of telephone calls that have happened in the past, and we get them, but we don't get the content. And I think ECPA draws a very good distinction between connection logs and subscriber information, things like that, and content. And that is a distinction that has to be preserved, because that does allow us to have quicker, easier access to things that are less personal, like connection logs, like subscriber info, and yet a heightened protection for things that you would expect it, like the content of emails.
right, so you're fine if the content of emails, you would be able to function as a prosecutor if to get content of emails you always needed a search warrant.
In effect, in the Ninth Circuit, we do function that way.
I guess that's right, yeah. Okay. Dave, one thing I've been wondering is there's been a lot of talk about the sophistication of these hackers that went after Google and these 30 other companies. They were in the networks for a long time. They were smuggling things out by VPN, and they used a variety of techniques. Do you have any insight into how sophisticated they are compared to criminal hackers, meaning financially oriented hackers rather than intelligence-oriented hackers? Are they really that much better, or is this just kind of the state of the art now?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I think there is, I think even some of the hacks they're pulling off range from really sophisticated to pretty unsophisticated, right? Scanning the environment and seeing where there might be a weakness and penetrating in. I was involved in a recovery of a company that was hacked into. It was the originating IPs were Chinese, so we assumed at the time that it was probably from there. And it was decidedly unsophisticated at the time. They had a wide open network and that sort of thing. So that sort of thing still happens, and I think some of the hacks that happened that were, espionage oriented as opposed to identity theft and so on were of that variety. The vast majority of the hacks we see today, like I was saying before, really aren't that imaginative. Mm-hmm. We see an escalation in complexity and in using more social networking information. For example, you'll see things now that just you couldn't do a few years ago from an attacker perspective. Like they'll go through they'll get one person's account on a social network, find the latest thread, something you posted on, and then regurgitate that back to you and say, hey, wasn't that a great party last night? Click here to a photo I shot of you, or a photo of you, or something like that, and click on it. Is it rocket science? No, they're just kind of using things that weren't available before, and many times, like, the code they're using, they either got for free in an underground economy, or they're part of a crew, or some of this stuff. Some of the old bots used to be GPL, right? I mean, they were generally this stuff was just being swapped around. It was open source, so I think it kind of varies dramatically. And the components, what we're seeing is that the components for a sophisticated attack are so freely available now. It used to be a big deal to see a kernel mode rootkit, right? It just didn't happen. Now it's pretty standard. If it gets on your machine, it's going straight down to implant a kernel mode rootkit there. So it's just that the tools are so freely available now. It's not that the attackers have gotten so much more sophisticated. It's just so many of the tools are free, and I think that happens with the manual hacks too that are espionage oriented. A lot of them are just finding, say, an old version of Internet Explorer somehow that happens to be on the perimeter, and they're getting in that way. Yeah.
So the economic hacks and the espionage hacks, they're all operating at about the same level of sophistication.
Well, I don't have nearly as much current knowledge. I've dealt with some of the espionage hacks in the past when I worked on security services, and I helped do security response and that sort of thing for organizations. I haven't dealt with them recently. I'd imagine some of them are incredibly complex. But having said that, I think they really run the gamut. I mean, even you mentioned Albert Gonzalez. I mean, some of those were pretty sophisticated.
He was in some of these networks for years,
that's right.
Undetected.
Yep.
Like the military has come up with the term advanced persistent threats that they apply to stuff like the Google hack, like a foreign enemy coming in and living on a network for years and biding their time and slowly building up access.
Yeah.
It seems like it's not only is that the same thing that's been happening in the financial hacks, but that's the same thing we were doing back 20 years ago. Like I was on the phone company's network forever, and they'd exchange emails about like thinking they detected a hacker here or there, and I've already read the email. They'd try and backdoor something, and I already have a backdoor in it.
Yep.
So it seems like there's always been. There's really nothing new here. What's new is that we had a lot of very amateurish hackers coming up in the 90s and doing things like web defacements and crimes of opportunity and low-hanging fruit. And now they've kind of fallen away, and we're just back to where we were before all of that happened.
Or you could look at it the way that we've got a lot of professionals now who have no intellectual curiosity at all, not even that the script kiddies had. They're just looking at it as a job, and they're taking tools that, you know, a kernel mode rootkit used to be pretty fancy. I mean, we almost never saw it on the malware side. You would probably see it in some of the more sophisticated targeted hacks, but now the black market and the fact that there's sort of economic specialization in the black market and people who create weapons, you know, malware and that sort of thing, and make them freely available, it's sort of leveled the playing field. But the tools are the same. A slow and low attack, I mean, we've been talking about this sort of stuff for a long time and have seen it for a long time too. It's just that it's kind of freely available to anyone now who can participate in the black market.
Okay. So we've covered cybercrime, we've covered espionage. I'm sorry? What about the threat of cyber warfare? This is something that's getting a lot of attention now. I'm personally skeptical about it, but I got to bring it up. Is it actually possible for a foreign country to do serious enough damage to the U.S. through computers that it would be considered a national security event, or something that actually puts lives in jeopardy? And I'll ask you that.
Well, let me just say I'm not really qualified to answer on a grand level of that.
Is this something you're worried about?
But just drawing a parallel to experience in criminal investigations, if in a criminal investigation we can come across a botnet system that has 10,000 or 20,000 computers under its control, I'd say that could be turned into a pretty serious threat. That seems like it. Similarly, we also see circumstances where maybe it's not directly what you're talking about, which is sort of there's an exploit that blows up Hoover Dam or something like that. But if we consider fundraising activities through advanced fee scams, which it's a scam that's as old as the hills. However, you put it on the internet, and it's just like when telephones came in, we had the telemarketers, and it opened up a whole new arena for fraudsters. Well, it's the same thing with the internet. It's a huge arena for fraud as well, and a lot of that money that's made in that can be transferred to terrorist organizations. So that's something that shouldn't be forgotten, and that's active, that's going on.
Will a hack attack kill anybody in the next 10 years? Raise your hand for yes.
I think so. I can give you an example of a case I prosecuted where an individual hacked into his former company. He was the system administrator, and they were a medical imaging company that sent high-resolution medical images to UCLA, Johns Hopkins, Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, and individuals utilized this for treatment, and he shut their system down for 3 or 4 days. It was kind of a, to use an arson term, a vanity hack. A vanity arsonist is somebody who sets a fire so they can go and be a hero and put it out. And we see that often with certain types of hackers, and that's why he did that. But that had the possibility, it was just luck on his part that somebody didn't have an urgent need for that and suffer physical harm. But that was just random. That was just his good luck.
Okay, I have some questions from the audience here, and this first one is also for you, Matt. Should the proprietors of hacked databases be prosecuted for negligence for leaving their systems vulnerable?
That's a very good question.
Yeah.
That is a very good question. See, what can I say without... there are many throughout the country, and especially within 30 miles of where we sit, co-locator facilities that are probably used in this way. In other words, where you have a huge bank of servers and you rent a little portion of them, or you bring in your own servers and you put it in there, and the individuals who are running it couldn't care less what you're doing with it. And we've had time after time, we'll go in and we'll find hacking exploits, credit card exploits, child pornography being distributed on a massive scale, and the proprietors say, we have no idea what was going on there. You know, we just provide the access to the internet. And it's a major problem that the law requires that we show a certain mental intent before we can prosecute somebody, but in the proper case where we can show that the requisite intent, yeah, they should be prosecuted.
If they show intent to be complicit in a crime.
Yeah.
All right,
Right.
but like, should TJX be prosecuted for this green piece of paper I got?
No.
No? Nothing in the future? Not even thinking about it? I know you can't talk about
Yeah,
grand juries, but.
Right.
Okay. One shift I've noticed is that there was a time when the government seemed very reluctant to identify companies that lost consumer data for fear that future victims of breaches, or future companies that have been breached, won't come to the FBI or the Secret Service with information that they were hacked. Is that still a concern?
It's evolving, and it's a large part of what I've seen from having done this job for quite a while. I can see the shift that maybe 10 or 12 years ago, companies would be very reluctant to come forward, very reluctant to admit that they were hacked or in any way the victims of any kind of exploit. They didn't want the news to get out. They were afraid that their shareholders would revolt, or all kinds of terrible things. And they didn't have relationships with law enforcement, in other words, with Secret Service, with the FBI, with ICE, or with other local investigators. And so they didn't know how to get it done. They didn't know how to start an investigation. They didn't know what the results would be. And in building those relationships over time, I mean, we work with most of the large corporations in the Valley. We have many different investigations going on at any one time, and a level of trust goes up. They see a level of success. I think that if you want to pull back and look at a large message, the message is that I think is evolving, that corporations are trying to get the message out that, hey, if you attack us, we will respond. We will utilize every tool at our command, both civil litigation and criminal investigation, to respond. And I think that sort of strong response is positive, and it creates further positives.
Okay. Is Don Parker really in the audience? Wow. Don Parker, most of you probably know, he practically invented the field of computer crime, not by doing it, but by researching it back when nobody else had even heard of it. So Don's question, automated crime in a box, I'll ask this of you, is coming to realization. Copies of crimes can be bought and sold. Will automation of crime change and increase organized crime? So you can buy code through the Carter forms or whatever, like the Zeus bot that basically lets you plug and play and start making money, right?
Yeah, and we've already seen that become a reality, right? I mean, people, particularly those in the former Soviet bloc, people who might have the skills to be a programmer but can't make much money legitimately, look at this and say, hey, there's tools here, there's the availability, and there's little kind of fear of retribution. So, you know, you've got those people where they've got some of the skills, maybe not all of them, and the tools just make it that much more available. I mean, you look at the, you know, just the stat I called out before, just the sheer amount of malware kind of calls that out. So I think it's a reality we're kind of dealing with today. The interesting kind of permutation of that is what happens next. And one of the things we've seen that's kind of interesting is that in the latest threat report that we've done, a lot of the top sources for attacks, and some of these are victims inside those countries too, because one of the things we've seen for a long time is you get a big increase in broadband penetration, you're going to get a whole bunch of attacks coming out of that network as well, because the people are maybe don't have protection, they're still getting up to speed. But literally of the top, of the top 5 countries where a lot of malicious activity was coming out of, it was, 3 of them were BRIC countries. It was Brazil had finally displaced Germany at number 3 as a source of malicious activity, and Germany had been there for ages. China, I think, was number 2, and India had gone into that as well. And again, that's kind of mixing kind of victims as well as sources for actual attacks. But I think what we're seeing is that, the bar has been lowered and the means are out there to attack people across the globe very easily, and it's done nothing but accelerate the cycles. It hasn't made the attacks, any more creative or inventive. Matter of fact, like I was saying before, it's made them actually a lot more predictable. They're going where the money's at, and they're doing things that are available in automated tools. So lots of times, if you can get a hold of the tools, if you understand the tools, you can understand the attack. And clearly that's a little bit different in espionage cases like we talked about before, but it's a reality we're already dealing with today.
So in a way, the availability of crime kits, where you just download it, customize it, and launch it, it actually helps the good guys a bit as well.
In some ways, yes, but also in the way of predictability, yes. But having said that, on the flip side, you've got someone who's financially motivated to basically to make sure that Symantec, Norton's not detecting you and that it can get past it. So it simultaneously makes things more predictable, but also the financial element means that they're trying a lot harder and changing things a lot faster. So, what's been interesting to watch is when Web Attacker first came out, which was one of the first popular web attack toolkits, came out from Russia, these guys were charging like $1,000 for it, and you paid for it, and it was funny, they had a little marketing on their site. They had a poll to see how much you really would pay for Web Attacker, and I think they said around $500. Well, the price for Web Attacker today is 0. No one's paying for these attack toolkits anymore because there's so much piracy and they're generally freely available. So so what they're doing for is they're paying for support contracts and for content updates. So, it's yeah, it's changed things, and it's been kind of interesting to watch. They're dealing with a lot of the realities of the economy and the software market as well.
Okay, Matt, would you prosecute somebody for pirating a piece of attack code?
It depends if he copyrighted it first. But actually, if I could just comment on what Dave said just briefly, the ability to monetize the attacks is a weak link in the criminals' arena there.
Because they got to be paid.
They have to make this activity pay, and having a scripts for sale, script kiddie, whatever you want to call it, that allows the creator of that script to monetize his crime immediately. He doesn't have to have a successful exploit. He just has to sell it. Mm-hmm. And in fact, we just prosecuted a case where an individual wrote a script for cookie stuffing so that he could get a rebate from an online auction provider that you might have heard of. And, it worked extremely well, and he made a lot of money out of it. He never ran it as an attack against the company. He never ran it to the company. He just sold it to other people. We were lucky enough by identifying individuals who did run it and actually flipping them to find out who he was and prosecute him. But that's the danger of that it sort of frees them up to go into their R&D mode.
All right, well, that's crime in a box, which Don Parker, I think, predicted like 20 years ago. There's one here, Kevin. Tell us more about your hacking background. And if are you ever tempted to check if a site is secure before you order a product online? I just assume they're all insecure, but then so is shopping at TJ Maxx apparently, so it doesn't bother me that much. My hacking background, it's complicated. The short version, the thing that got me in the real trouble was I hacked into phone company computers. At first it was recreationally, But at one point I started taking over switches and then using my access to win radio station phone-in contests. So I got some sizable cash prizes and a Porsche, and then eventually got caught. No. Dave, what percent of home PCs do you think is infected with keyloggers?
Yeah, so recasting the question, what percentage of PCs do we think are infected in general? It really depends upon the country. Like I was saying before, in the U.S. In the U.S. Yeah, really good question. We know about 15%, so I'll get to it, but 15% of people probably have no protection whatsoever as a global standard. Again, that changes by country. I'd say the US is probably a little lower than that. The people traipsing around with no protection, particularly on older operating systems with older software, are clearly at the most risk. When you speak in general terms, the number of people who are infected at any time, it's hard to say. I'd say it probably, it probably hovers anywhere between 20 to 40 to maybe upwards of 50% when you've got a really novel new hack. And some of this comes back to significant new vulnerabilities. We don't see nearly the big cataclysmic vulnerabilities like we used to. Like there was vulnerability for Internet Explorer, the WMF exploit, which was massive. It wasn't patched, and there was just, at that point, the number of infections was skyrocketing because there was no patch available and because everyone, there was such an install base of Internet Explorer at the time and so on. So at that point, you see this massive increase of infections. And now I think we're at a state where the biggest threat we see is not surprisingly, you mentioned the Ukraine before, we see a lot of fake antivirus programs, a lot of them coming out of the Ukraine, and we're almost sort of at a steady state. I wouldn't be so bold as to put a number on it, but you see a lot of fake antivirus infections and bogus alerts, and you still see a lot of keyloggers too, but it's kind of like, keyloggers are somewhat like kernel mode rootkits, like we were saying before. They're just a function of a piece of malware now that you can throw in if you want it. It's readily available, so it's almost, it's mundane at this point. Most infections are going to have some form of dropper Trojan and probably have some form of keylogging.
All right. Audrey, U.S. tools for investigations like CALIA, which is the automated wiretapping system that law enforcement can use to listen in on phone calls with a court order, they end up being put in tools that are sold to repressive regimes like China. Is there anything that can be done to prevent this within the U.S.? Like, are there any policy or technical steps that can be taken?
Well, the U.S. has export controls on technology. They control what you can export from this country. It's not necessarily the way that this kind of thing should be handled. If the question is it possible? Perhaps. Is it useful? Probably not.
So nothing can be done?
Sure. You could put more restrictive export controls on technology.
But it sounds like you're saying that would be a bad idea?
Yeah, at this point, the technology industry is relatively global. It is global. It's everywhere, and so U.S. export controls on commercial technology that's going abroad doesn't really make a lot of sense anymore, especially with regard to things like encryption technologies that are standardized and globally available and being used that the U.S. still control. So does the U.S. have mechenisms that they could use to do that? Absolutely. Is it something that is reasonable? I'm not sure. We'd have to.
Here's the question then. CALIA, this was a law that basically Congress passed that says that telephone systems or telecommunication systems have to be designed with a technical back end, like a back door, that allows the government to come in and listen in on phone calls without having to put alligator clips on anybody's phone. So it created a technical standard and a whole basic technology for automated government eavesdropping, which in the U.S. requires a court order, and we have all of these safeguards and so on.
It may
but then,
require a court order, or it may
well,
not.
Certainly, okay.
Yeah.
And then, but by mandating the creation of this technology, then companies start producing it, and then they start selling it to other markets. So when we create a technological mandate for surveillance, do we have an obligation as a democracy to look ahead at how creating this market and fostering the development of a surveillance technology is going to be used elsewhere?
Do we have an obligation as a democracy? Yes, perhaps we do from a moral and ethical standpoint. I think you're getting to a larger question, which is how does technology today function in a global economy where moral and ethical beliefs and cultures vary drastically from country to country. And so the question is, I think maybe the right answer is maybe government shouldn't be mandating technology specifications as a general policy matter. I think it's a really challenging an area of policy because it is not necessarily fair for us to superimpose our beliefs and our democratic system on others. At the same time, I think we have standards of human rights that we would like to see upheld globally, and that I can at least speak from the perspective of technology providers. Certainly don't want to be in the position of violating human rights, but it's a little more complicated than that, and I think it's probably just good for the government to stay out of the business of telling companies how to build products and what they have to put in them and what they don't have to put in them.
Okay. Speaking of surveillance, an audience member thinks the NSA should be put in charge of cybercrime and cybersecurity. Would you agree?
No.
Anybody agree? Anybody in the audience agree? Well, somebody does. Or they're trolling me. How many of the panelists use online banking services? How about in the audience?
That was 40% of PCs that are owned right now, you said?
Yeah. Should we be? Matt?
Should we be what?
Should we trust online banking services?
Should we
That's a
trust
different
regular
question.
banks? I think is the real question. I think that's as good as I'm going to get on that answer.
Nothing in there about hedge fund managers.
Yeah. I mean, generally to me, it's I no longer see that online activity is any less secure than offline activity because it's all online. I mean, who would have thought that when you go into a 7-Eleven or again a TJX or an Office Max and swipe your ATM that goes over the internet or over an internet-connected network. But it does, and that's where like all the major data thefts of the past few years have happened. Right? They haven't happened through online commerce. You're safer statistically having ordered something from Amazon.com or another web store than you are having gone to a brick and mortar store and swiped your credit card there. So it's all the same there.
Yeah, and the same is true for identity theft. Like more identities are stolen offline than online still, and the FTC does a good job of reporting that every year.
There are a lot of questions about the security of the electrical grid, both today and the smart grid that's being phased in now. Any opinions on that?
Well, I think in general, you'd asked before if anyone would die due to a hacking incident. The one thing we're seeing is that there's just a massive number of devices that are getting internet enabled right now, whether it's home grid, whether it's a digital picture frame, whether it's a Blu-ray player, a game console, you name it. The whole realm of embedded. We don't think people, just to be clear, we don't think people are going to be buying little yellow boxes for their Blu-ray player with Norton antivirus on it. But having said that, You know, it's, I think there's a lot of indications that, you know, I think the people who are putting out the products are trying to get these things out fast. They're dealing with massive cost pressures. They're competing with incredible time to market, you know, particularly if you're trying to produce a 3D television right now or something along those lines. And I think it's true for a lot of, you know, the market, even for home grid products, is incredibly competitive as well. So these guys are dealing with, with the connection to the internet that they don't necessarily, and I say that broadly, not necessarily about the smart grid. My wife works at SoCal Edison, so I'll be in deep trouble at home if I get this wrong. But you know, the ramifications of this massive number of devices that are being connected to the internet right now by the people who are producing devices and so forth isn't really well understood.
So they're rushing in too fast.
In some instances, I'd say they are. In other ones, perhaps they're a bit more prescient, but they're facing incredible market forces, and the same thing that has pushed companies to put out websites that weren't ready, that made them ripe for, you know, hacking by Albert Gonzalez and his crew, Ehud Tenenbaum and so forth. You know, they're facing the same pressure, and they're putting it out there, and it's brand new, and they haven't had devices connected to the internet before, and perhaps they don't appreciate all the nuances of what it takes to prevent unauthorized access.
I think there's been a lot of work. I know you're not asking me, but I think there's been a lot of work done in this space, especially with regard to the electric grid specifically. I mean, smart grid's another thing, but you know, for a long time we've been trying to simulate what attacks to control systems would look like, and you know, the data's not always great, and I think the overall data on infrastructure interdependencies and if X goes out, Y will happen is hard to model, and there's certain challenges there. But you know, I think people have been thinking about what the implications to the electric grid are for some time. I know the press likes to think that maybe we haven't been thinking about it for a long time, but reasonably, I think people have been thinking about it, and it just makes you know, owners and operators of those systems, you know, they're more critical. It's more important that they know how to secure their systems and networks, and perhaps that they're not just connecting to the open network.
Yeah, you know, that one gets asked a lot.
Yeah.
To your point, it's asked a lot of the time, and the industry's reached out. And I remember, you know, 5 years ago, that industry was asking for specialized intrusion prevention signatures for detecting odd SCADA system traffic, so which doesn't normally happen.
That request came from industry?
Yeah, there was pressure from industry to go in and develop specialized tools like that to protect SCADA system.
And you know, the response unit at DHS, for example, at Homeland Security, has a specific control system security response program. I can't speak to how perfect it is, because responding is never a perfect thing, because you've already let something bad happen to you. But there, you know, there's lots of people who are trying to work on that issue. So I think additional modeling around and getting hard data around what the consequences are of interdependent attacks on an infrastructure is an area where we should be putting a lot more time and resources before we go running around and saying we're all going to die because Hoover Dam's going to get, you know, whatever your example was. Because I don't know that we have the greatest economic analysis of that yet. What's the real impact?
One of the ways that the data is being collected is through a program that the FBI runs, the Department of Justice program called InfraGuard, which is to infrastructure, to protect the infrastructure. And while I don't know that I could give you a statistic of attack one was prevented by going to a meeting of InfraGuard, the point is that at this juncture, and it's been in place for a number of years, critical industries are meeting with law enforcement and DHS and other government entities to share information. And that didn't happen 12, 15 years ago. It was two separate worlds. And so I think to the extent that that information is coming in through industry to you know, government agencies, that's a good thing.
Yeah, it's a good example of a successful public-private partnership.
InfraGuard.
Yeah.
There have been incidents on the power grid, right? We know there was a software bug in an energy management system that contributed to the blackout in 2003. There was an incident of a computer virus, a slammer worm, getting into a nuclear power plant in Ohio and crippling one of their safety monitoring systems. So we're seeing interconnections, like this is a corporate, a plant network that's connected to the corporate network that's connected to the internet. Should there be liability imposed on companies that leave connections like that open, that connect to critical infrastructures? Is there anything that we can do about this when there's no obvious economic motive for utilities to do anything about it themselves?
Well, I don't know that there's no obvious economic motive. I mean, it seems like it's an obvious economic motive to not be compromised. It sounds like it's raining. But if that's not enough, a lot of these infrastructure sectors are regulated. Like the nuclear power sector, for example, is heavily regulated and have standards that they have to meet for quality and compliance and all sorts of other things. And they're starting to look at cybersecurity as part of that. And that's a reasonable thing for regulated infrastructure sectors to be doing. The Department of Energy does this, and this is very uninteresting compared to the rain. I get that.
Can I assume hackers have taken over the climate control system? So I think we're going to wrap up. Let me just see. This is a good one. I'll ask this of all of you. Why do we take it for granted now that clicking a link or viewing a picture will compromise your PC? Why is none of this safe? Isn't that an admission of system design failure? Audrey? Really, you can't click on a link anymore. You can't open a PDF.
I don't know. I click on links. I open PDFs. I'm not compromised.
All right.
I think it's not all for naught.
Dave?
If you
would you open PDFs?
All sorts of PDFs, every day. Look, I think it's easy to overplay the risk, and particularly in a setting like this.
There's so much 0 day out there all the time now.
It's like I was saying before that the 0 days, they're out there. Having said that, we've been dealing with 0 days for a while, and there's ways of even detecting that stuff. But the thing that's a lot harder to do is to help people make good decisions that are about to be duped into doing something, particularly when it looks like it's a video for the, showing you doing something at the party last night, which you might be really interested in clicking on. So, this is...
But it comes from a friend, a Facebook friend or something.
Yeah,
it looks like
or
it's a response to an email you sent them.
Absolutely.
That comes back.
Yep.
You can't train yourself not to click on that.
That's right. The answer isn't...
And the fact that we're being asked to...
Yep.
Doesn't that point to something like just like the questioner said, like a systemic failure?
I don't know about systemic failure. If systemic failure, Facebook probably wouldn't have nearly the number of users they have now, and we wouldn't have all raised our hands with online banking, right? But I think what it calls out is that as a security company, the way that I look at this is my job used to be a bodyguard. We used to be the bodyguard of the PC, let the good files in, keep the bad stuff out, that sort of thing. But what it means is our job in the future means that we have to be a lot more like, God, this is a bad analogy, but it's sort of, the David Carradine in Kung Fu, right? Where you have to keep the bad stuff out and beat it up, but you also have to guide someone and provide advice. So terrible analogy, but you get the idea. We have a role as sort of a Sherpa in the future to help people make good decisions and provide them the information to make a good decision, as opposed to just sort of letting the good stuff in and keeping the bad stuff out.
All right. Matt, do you click on links?
I don't think David Carradine was a Sherpa. I don't know.
He provided great advice.
I was trying to follow, but no, I agree with whatever Dave said. But I have a less technical sort of response to that. Yes, you could say if we're not getting to 5 nines of quality control on keeping the bad stuff out, it's a systemic failure. But the reality is, in the modern world, does your system work? Does it operate? Does it allow you to do what you want to do? And for most of us, for the vast majority of the time, it does. And so how can you say the system is failing?
Well, because it's also,
when
it's also helping the Chinese and the Ukrainians do what they want to do with our computers.
It's true, but the point is we need the system. We have to operate it somehow. It must be operated. It cannot be shut down.
Right,
It's like the highways. There are car accidents, but...
What I know is, like, 4 or 5 years ago, I could tell my parents, don't open executable attachments. That's it. That's the big fear. Don't open executable attachments and run antivirus, and you're probably okay. Now, they can't open anything. I have to tell them, if it's an attachment, don't open it. Like, I should find a way to just disable attachments on their computers. Like period. It seems like things have gotten dramatically worse, and we're losing a lot of functionality. And am I wrong?
I think what you see is that, you know, people are absolutely still getting hit, and when you get hit, it's a lot worse than what it was before because it's much more stealthy, it's going right after your identity and so forth. Is it as bad as the days of like 2005 and 2004 and 2003 in particular, when phishing was going crazy, when adware, spyware was going crazy and so forth? I would say the rate of infections today are probably lower than in those heydays, but the people who are getting hit today aren't just getting crazy pop-ups, they're getting their identity stolen, their machines completely tied up or held hostage and that sort of thing. So it's, you know, is it terrible out there? No, I totally agree with Matt. I mean, for the vast majority of people, it works fine, but if you do get hit today, it is a lot worse than what it used to be.
Okay. On that note, thank you all. This has been terrific.
Thank you, Kevin, and thanks to all of you tonight. That was great. It was just a really terrific panel, and I think we all leave maybe feeling both a little more fearful and a little safer. I'm not quite sure, but it was terrific. And I feel an obligation to explain to you that if you felt you were saying something really serious and people were still chuckling, it's because we were being hacked during the event, and we had a warning appearing. No, something was appearing on the screen behind you. It wasn't necessarily a virus warning, but that was why the occasional chuckling was happening. I want to just say that we have an internet history program here, and we're the only institution of our kind in the country, we're pretty sure, that does that. The founding curator, Mark Weber, is doing a terrific job collecting the history of the internet and networking, and this program is an important part of that. So that's one reason that we're involved in this and we're celebrating this anniversary. I have a gift for all of you before you leave, so please join me in thanking them one more time, and have a safe drive home. Thank you.
That's right, you handed it to me.